So Thursday I picked up this little gem. So in case if you're curious to know what this is a wide angle lens. It's a Nikkor, obviously, so it's the Nikon branded. Good stuff, like tank. This is the one that has no rubber rings on it. So this is actually a non-AI lens. So this is one of the older ones. So if you can read that there, this is a Nikkor UD. I'm not entirely sure what UD, it might be ultra dispersion or something like that. I don't know, it's probably to do with the coating on it. And it's a 20 millimeter f3.5. So this has been a focal length I've been wanting to pick up for a very long time since I got into photography on a DSLR. So back in the day, back in my day, I had an iPhone, so in high school. So I would go on Ken Rockwell and I'd look at all the weird lenses and stuff. I'd go on Flickr and see all the cool stuff that people take pictures with. And this was always a focal length that I never had the means to afford and I couldn't find, but it always seemed like it'd be super cool to use and super useful. I don't know how to say it. It looks cool, it had a weird shape to it, and it took about, I don't know, count forward from 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. It took me about 8 years to pick up one, but I finally did. So this is obviously, like I said, the non-AI version. And I actually did grow a need for this focal length. So a 20 millimeter is definitely a pretty decently wide angle lens. There are definitely way more. Like this one I have. This one's a 15 millimeter. A little bit of a difference, but so this was a focal length I didn't have, and I wanted to fill a void. So I went from having a 15 millimeter to a 24 millimeter. And if you've never played with those focal lengths on a full frame camera, it is an immense change from one side of the scale to the other. It's a very steep change. So you go from having something that's ridiculously wide, that's going to flare a lot, and I don't remember what the field of view of this lens is, but it's absolutely crazy. You should look up some images. I have some on Facebook, probably. Not a good place to look for them. Try my Instagram, or I don't even have them on Flickr because I don't even use Flickr anymore. I definitely have them on my Instagram. So, well, a lens like this 15 millimeter, it's awesome for interiors because you can encapsulate most of the interior. If you go between the front seats from the back, you can essentially pick up probably about both of the mirrors from the center console. So you can get a huge amount of the car, and you do get a little bit of distortion because it's closer to the camera than where it functions the best, I should say. This lens was made for architecture, which it does absolutely amazingly. It's a rectilinear lens, so it keeps the lines straight. However, when you get closer to it, it does start to show more of a distortion, but that's because it's a wide angle. It is not a fisheye. So then it takes me to what I was shooting before, which is my 24 millimeter. Super nice little lens, not heavy or anything. I picked up this one to replace my older copy last summer, and I got a really good deal on it, and it's in incredible shape. Everything's super snappy and focus is super smooth. Optics are like perfect. Anyway, not really relevant to what I'm trying to tell you about, but the 24 millimeter is still a pretty wide lens on the 35 millimeter body. And this I would use for cars when I shoot multiple cars in a single frame, because this one can give you some cool effects and some distortion. However, if you shoot a car, it's going to make the car look very small in the environment. If you get too close to it, it's going to start to distort, and it's not really the lens for everything. So then you go to this one. This one I could shoot 2 cars in frame, definitely without a problem. And the thing is because it's closer to a 50 millimeter, it's closer to what your eye sees, it reproduces the car in a more pleasing manner than if you got close with a 15 millimeter. So this is what I was using. It's okay enough for interiors, but really not my preference. So I shoot rig shots on a car where I attached a pole to the car. You should check out my Volvo video I shot for Jacobs Magazine last year. And you can see the whole process of how I set it up and how I take the pictures. It's essentially this huge illusion of speed as you attach the camera to the car. So as your car is moving along, you have your camera at the end, and you're moving it at the exact same pace as the car, as the camera, and it makes your car nice and sharp while the long shutter blurs everything else. I was not the one that found that technique. That's been around for a while, but super, super, super useful and cool technique. So what I started off with was my 18-55, and that is just the basic kit lens. It was an AFS lens, and it works enough. I could shoot that on my D3200 at 18 millimeter, which I can't remember what it reproduces to, but it's probably closer to 30 millimeter, so not very wide. It's a 1.4 or 1.5 crops to 18, so yeah, you're about 35 millimeter if I'm correct. So it was fine. The optics are not awful on those, but not really my preferred lens. This older stuff for me seems to be very sharp and is what I prefer. So I went from that, and then I went to a 24 millimeter. And then when I, scrounged up the courage, I mounted this to the rig. And this was me just, learning to rig a car. So the focal lengths of what they reproduce for a car when you have it on the pole, it's about a 10-foot pole. It goes from the corner of the hood by the driver to about 4 foot past or off of the car. So not very far away, but you have to work with what you got. So this one right here is perfect if you want to encapsulate just the car. The 24 millimeter focal length at the length I'm shooting from the car lets me essentially frame the car dead center of the frame with just a little bit of margin on both sides, so it's a nice full look in the final image. And this is actually what produced some of my absolute favorite images from that Jacobs Magazine shoot, because you get the detail of the car, you have just a little bit of the interior or the environment still in the image, but way, 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 way more focus on the car. So I should probably go grab it. This is my Hot Wheels that I'm going to use for reference, so you have an idea of what these focal lengths produce on the final image. So you have your car here, correct? So you strap a pole from here to here, and the camera hangs off here. And with the 24 millimeter, what I was getting from that was essentially the frame kind of looked like this. The camera was kind of low in the car, but not very low. It was just underneath the top body line of the fender. And you essentially had a frame that had this much environment on the side, like this much, and this much on the back. So proportionally, a lot more car than environment. And it honestly looked really good. When I used the 15 millimeter on the rig, which was actually my first go-to, essentially, you get the car like this. You have a lot of stuff to Photoshop out too. And then you have a lot of environment around it. Way more than you would think with the distance that the camera was set off the car. You wouldn't think you'd get that much environment. But what I found, what happens with that is the car kind of starts to produce kind of a little weird. I mean, it's not really that strange. It's just seeing such a small car in the frame just feels kind of strange. But it did actually make the cover image, so it didn't produce a bad image, so don't think that it didn't. But I'm just nitpicky because I'm, my own worst critic, and I'm an artist. So anyway, you went from having a small little car in frame to filling out the entire frame with a car. I didn't have anything in the middle, and honestly, this came up for sale locally, and it wasn't even advertised, actually. I was buying my other lens, and I asked to see if there's anything else that the man had, and he had a 20 millimeter. So I have not put this one on the rig yet, but what's going to happen once I do use it for that is I should be getting a nice in-between in terms of framing. Instead of being a small car in the frame, or a small car in the frame, or a very large car in a small environment, or a small amount of environment in the frame, I should get like a medium. And it might sound kind of stupid that I'm nitpicky like that, but this is going to allow me another framing. I could always crop the 15 millimeter in post, that's correct, but I'm an in-camera person, and you'll always get better results if you do it better in the first place, do it right in camera. And this is going to be a nice in-between. And what I haven't told you about this, where this is going to shine a lot more, other than focal length, is when it comes to these front elements. So this 15 millimeter and this 24 probably don't look very similar, do they? Yeah. Well, both amazing pieces of glass. However, this one right here has a huge problem with it, or a huge fault that kind of holds it back. And that's the fact that it doesn't have filter rings in the front of it. This lens has a filter on the rear that it's called a bayonet filter. So you just can't, I have not, and I cannot buy a neutral density filter for this frame, for the bayonet filter. It's a 39 millimeter. Actually, it's not 39. 39 is a drop-in. So it's probably in the 20s. So I can't put a neutral density filter on this. And when it comes to rig shots, that's a pretty big killer. Then you have to worry about your conditions being right in order to use this one. Not a good sunny day lens, because you have to cut down your aperture super, super, super small. Large f number. This one right here, which is cool, is it has a filter thread. It's a 52 millimeter, which is super common among most of the Nikkor glass of that era. That's within a normal focal length without being a 300 millimeter, 15, a 6. Look up a 6 millimeter. I swear you'll poop yourself a little bit. They're super cool though. And when I went to shoot that magazine for Jacobs, I was hoping for a nice gray day, because this one right here, what I was anticipating using, didn't have a filter ring. I couldn't use it. You can get this huge clunky thing that goes on the top of, around and snugs the outside of the hood, but then you have to have a massive filter for it. And I don't even know if they even make neutral density for that at all. You might be able to get a gel and use it, but aren't you kind of taking a little bit of the optical quality away at that point? So not really the best option. So, I had to use this one. I had to resort to this after a while, because when you're doing rig shots, you do not want to ride at f22. And the reason you don't want to do that is because of diffraction. So if you don't know what diffraction is that you have your aperture in the middle right there, right? You might be able to see it. When you stop it down, f22, you're cutting out a lot of light, and you do still get an image, but because of the rules of diffraction, it actually creates for a softer image. So really, on these old Nikkor lenses, what you really want to look for are the yellow markers. Yellow markers are the lenses are, they're not calibrated, it's just where they optically perform at their sharpest without losing sharpening to diffraction. So ideally on my stuff, I'd only want to shoot down to f11, depending on what lens. This one's f11. This one would be f11. I have some that are f16, which would be a macro lens. So you don't want to cut it down through the aperture. So that's when you put a neutral density filter on a lens, so you can cut it down to f11 or f8, and you'll have the sharpest image possible. That's a long story to get to a small point, but hopefully this helps you learn a little bit. So if you don't already know this. So it's 20 millimeter. Fortunately, it's not a 52 millimeter thread. However, it is a 72 millimeter thread. So having a thread means you can put a filter on it, and there's no bayonet filter to have to figure out. It's just not going to limit you in that regard. And I'm going to be, I haven't gotten to it yet because I just acquired this. I'm going to be buying probably a 4-stop neutral density filter for this lens, 72 millimeter, which will also fit my 85, so that on this lens, so I can drag the shutter longer, especially when it's brighter out. Because without that, you're going to get very, very quick shutter speeds, or you're just going to blow out your image. The lens like this, my 85 that I just showed you in a previous video, 72 millimeter, and because of the aperture, this one only goes down to f16, and it looks like the colors are faded on this lens, but there's a huge difference between the lenses at the point. Your most optically sharp and darkest image you can produce without losing sharpening to diffraction looks to be on this lens to be f5.6. That's a huge difference in comparison to f11. That's 2 stops. No, 3 stops, my bad. So when I put the 4-stop filter on this one, not going to be quite the same effect. I mean, you can use it to drag, but what I want it on this lens for is for the fact that then I can shoot my shallow depth of field during the day, and I don't have to ride my shutters quick. And sometimes you can't even get your shutter to go quick enough to shoot wide open, so you have to settle for a smaller aperture. Not really relevant to what I'm talking about, but... So, more specifics about this lens. So this is the non-AI one. The guy named Bob is actually the person that modified this one. As it's a non-AI, honestly, I've never seen this modification ever in my life. I've seen shaved aperture rings so that it looks like the AIS models, so that you don't have any interference with the aperture ring on your camera. This one is actually, the rear ring is actually thinner on the back of it, so the prong can actually go over the top of the lip altogether and clear it with a gap. So what you can see what Bob did here was he actually moved the rabbit ears from the lens. He flipped it. Instead of being centered, he flipped it on the one screw and glued it to the ring, and cut the rabbit ears far enough back where the tab in the camera will rest at its widest opening, at its largest aperture. And it actually works. I was a little bit hesitant because you do not want to put non-AI stuff on your camera models between the pretty much anything that's full frame, the 7000 series, and I think that's about it, because the 5000s, 3000s, and then like this double digits like the D40s, D60s, and stuff like that, they do not have this tab here, so you can mount any kind of Nikkor lens to it and you won't damage it. The D90 and D80s do have this aperture ring, or this arm, so you can damage it if you put the wrong lens on there. Anyway, so this one actually does work. It's a very weird way to fix the problem. I've never seen it before. However, it does, strangely, oddly enough, does fit the camera body and works pretty well. The only thing that I've noticed with this is, because he took it apart, is these screws in the back protrude just a little bit on top of the surface of the lens, so I might replace these so that they're flush with the mount a little bit better. But it does work, so I will be using it. But I have a few pictures I took with it. Honestly, the focal length, what it reproduces to, what it reminds me of, would be the wide angle setting on an iPhone. I only got an iPhone that had multiple lenses about 3 months ago, so it's kind of new to me. I only had a standard wide angle. The ultra wide angle on an iPhone is essentially looking like this on a 35mm. If you really want to be blown away, this will definitely blow an iPhone out of the water in terms of wide angle. But pretty cool shit, right? I think so. So I hope this helped you learn something if you're not super fluent with lenses and mechanics. My stupid grip's starting to lift, unfortunately, on this camera, so I'm probably have to replace it. Dang it. But yeah, if you want to see some more stuff, listen to some more, camera talk, you can let me know down below. I mean, I have quite a few focal lengths at this point to kind of talk about. And I've only learned from watching people on YouTube and learning from playing with the lenses myself. A really good source of information, whether you can tolerate them or not, I don't know. I can. Would be the Angry Photographer on YouTube. He knows a lot of stuff, and he probably owns most all of the older Nikkor lenses and stuff, even some newer stuff. So if you don't mind listening to rambling, good place to go for information. But a lot of this stuff I've learned from using it in the field, and it's helpful to know, especially if you can avoid being in a situation where you need something and you don't have it. So let me know if there's anything you want to learn about when it comes to older lenses. So thanks again for watching.